video we're going to talk about why does the 1996 train make the classic sound that it makes. Why does it make that very distinctive sound? So many train enthusiasts will tell you that's because that train has GTO inverters and that train has IGBT inverters. Well, it's all very well saying that, but a lot of people don't even know what that means. The IGBT or GTO is just the name of the transistor technology used. IGBT, being a more modern technology, has a higher switching frequency, so it makes a higher sound. But the actual sound, that sound, has got nothing to do with the transistor technology. In fact, it's a lower pitch has, but the actual sound itself is to do with how the motor is pulsed. It's the VF drive pulsing out an artificial AC wave from a DC supply. But overall, you could say the actual sound it makes is entirely a byproduct of how the software has been programmed. And the actual sound that you hear does not affect the motor's torque, as it sounds like it's changing gear. It's just a sound which is a byproduct of how it's been programmed. So how did the programmers program a VF drive and end up with that sound? Seems rather crazy. Well, to explain that, I'll have to first go through the entire history of how motors work. So let's go. So back in 1900, two different types of motor, DC and AC. DC motor is very simple. You put in electricity and it turns. You get instant torque when the motor first starts. And then that torque fades out as the motor gets quicker, but it's a very obvious, simple design motor. You put in electricity, the motor speeds up, starts off with lots of acceleration. As it speeds up faster, acceleration reduces, and it's just your classic characteristic of how a motor works. So you'd thought that everything would be DC, but it's not. Most things are AC, and that is because in 1900, how do you get the DC power? It's to do with the supply of power through the different substations. Because to supply power from power station to where you want it, you have to change it up to a high voltage, then reduce it to a lower voltage, so there's less losses. And to change the amount of voltage, you have to have AC, because a change in AC electricity makes a change in magnetic field. A change in magnetic field makes AC electricity, and you use that principle in a transformer to change your voltages. So you start off with one voltage, you switch it to a really high voltage, low current for your distribution, and back down to a lower voltage but more current to be used in your application. With DC, a DC electricity makes a DC magnetic field, which you can use for like a maglock on a door, but the DC magnetic field, you're not able to generate back DC electricity from that, which means that all supply has to be AC. And in the 1900s, it was very difficult to convert your AC to DC, which is why most motors are AC. But it gets more complicated than that, because AC motors don't have as nice a characteristic as a DC motor. An AC motor is only efficient when the speed of a motor is close to your supply frequency. And because AC power is turning off and on, it's alternating, rather than DC, which is direct. DC is a lot more simple, DC makes sense. AC is a lot more complex, because it's continually changing to positive and negative. But with an AC motor, a standard AC motor is using slippage. Frequency will be going around at 50 Hz, because that's your electricity that's coming in. You have three phases. I'm not talking about single phase motors, by the way. I'm talking about three phase motors. Single phase motors are very pathetic, and for this video I'm only talking about three phase because that's what's used in industry. So three phase motor, rotating magnetic field, because of the order of the phases, it makes a sort of magnetic field that turns around your motor 50 Hz. Then your motor speeds up to at 50 Hz through slippage, but it's only efficient when the rotating magnetic field is close to the rotation of the motor. So for something fairly simple, like an application that goes a fairly constant speed, AC motors work. But when you have a train that's going like 100 miles an hour and it needs most of its torque when it first starts, because when it first starts, the magnetic field will be going at a set frequency and the motor won't be moving when it first starts. You have the lowest amount of torque when it first starts, meaning AC motors cannot be used for trains. Also, another thing is coming in as just one overhead wire, so it'd be single phase AC, not three phase. So pretty much AC's never going to work for trains. They had to convert it to DC. Now in the 1900s, conversions were complicated. There wasn't like big diodes back then, and often they'd use universal motors, like you often get in cheapy washing machines, which is basically a DC motor but you're bodging with AC. When we get into more like 1930s, 1950s, they're converting your electricity from AC to DC to put in the motor, so you get a nice DC motor with that instant torque characteristic. So that is your basic characteristics of how motors work. AC motors are much more efficient but only work well near the supply frequency, so cannot be used on trains that needs instant torque from the start. So trains have to use DC motors. But there's a problem. DC motors have a massive inrush current problem. When you first start the motor up and the motor's not moving, you get a massive amount of torque and a massive amount of current, and this current will destroy the motor. So this means that inrush current has to be limited by starting a motor off at a lower voltage. Also, you can't simply use like a little variable resistor like a volume control, which you'd use like on a music player, because when you're doing much higher levels of power here, you'd actually have to use high power resistors. And so you have resistor banks, which are like resistors designed for taking high levels of current without resistors overheating. And you have loads of resistor banks on your train, and they all turn in parallel. So when the train first starts, one resistor bank turns on. Then as it speeds up, it turns on next resistor bank, then the next one, and each time resistor bank turns on, more current can go through more resistors to get to a motor, so you're increasing current slowly as the train speeds up. And by the time the train gets to 20 miles an hour, all of the resistor banks will be turned on. Then when it gets to about 25 miles an hour, the resistor banks will be bypassed and the train will be being fed direct power. And if you go to any old train, you can actually feel the jolts, like on the 1972 Underground train. As it speeds up, you can feel slight jolts as each resistor bank turns on. But that is a bit of a primitive way, because of something called Ohm's law. With Ohm's law, every single point of resistance in a circuit dissipates power. So using resistor banks, well, that's really inefficient, because those resistor banks, as well as limiting the current, also are dissipating power. They heat up. Really inefficient. So we need a better way of sorting this problem, and that is with transistors. And it's only when we get to 1980s we have transistors big enough to switch massive supplies of power for the train motors. But in the 80s, transistors were fairly new and the transistor technology wasn't that good. They're still able to switch a high amount of power required, but not very fast. Only about 200 times a second. The biggest important thing of a transistor compared to a resistor is a transistor switches the power on and off instantly. The power can either be 100% on or 0% on, completely off. You can never have it halfway, because transistors cannot dissipate power. And this is a vitally important thing for all of transistor control on trains. You must never dissipate power in your transistors. So a transistor can either be off or on. And as these can switch at about 200 times a second, I simply turn the transistor on or off 200 times a second, and the amount of time it's on and the amount of time it's off pretty much gives you the voltage. So it might have 10% on, 90% off. Then that will give you like 10% of the train's voltage, which will start off actually at low voltage, so you get low current, because voltage and current are linked because of Ohm's law when the train first starts off, so you don't get the inrush current. Then as the train speeds up, by the time it gets to 20 miles an hour, it'll be 90% on and 10% off. So remember, these transistors are switching off really fast, 200 times a second, on, off, on, off, on, off, constantly. And the amount of time on and the amount of time off varies to slowly increase your voltage. Then when the train gets to 25 miles an hour, the transistors are bypassed and the motor is fed directly. And this is what you hear on the 1992 train. So when the train starts up, it makes this noise. And that first sound you hear, sound, is your 200 hertz of the motor being turned on and off really fast. So, after the 80s, we then go into the 90s, and I use this transistor principle, but with AC. AC motors were considered limiting. Their motors might be more efficient, but they're very much limiting with the torque. But an AC motor is more efficient than a DC motor. So this means if you can vary the frequency of the AC motor, because remember, AC motors only work when the frequency of the supply is close to the rotating frequency. So if you can vary that frequency, you can keep the motor efficient at all times and actually make an AC motor better than a DC motor. Because you can vary frequency, you can make an AC motor deliver that instant torque like a DC motor, but it will do it better than a DC motor. So that is why we need AC motors. But we need to vary the frequency, and we can't vary the supply frequency. That is set, that's 50 hertz. And also it has to be three phase, when the AC supply coming in on the overhead on most trains is only one phase. We need it three phases. So first things first, if a supply is coming in on overhead, that has to be converted to DC. This step is not required if the supply is coming in by third rail. So you now got DC power, and from that DC power you then need to make an artificial AC wave. And that AC wave will speed up as the train speeds up. And because the wave's speeding up as the train speeds up, the frequency is always close to the motor's rotating frequency, meaning the AC motor will always be efficient. And now we come into VF drives. This is what a VF drive is. It's doing a very similar principle to DC pulsing, where you're using a transistor to switch on and off the supply. It's doing pretty much the same thing, but instead of just switching on and off a DC supply, it has to switch on and off a DC supply to make an artificial AC wave. So, got a DC supply from a third route with its overhead, it's been converted from AC to DC, and now from that, start making a wave. And you can make a wave by turning it on very slightly, then turning it off. Often you do that a couple of times, then turn it on for a medium, sort of like a medium amount, then turn it off, then turn it on for a long little stretch, turn it off, then turn it on for a little tiny bit, turn it off, and then overall, if you look at a pattern on screen of turning it on and off following that pattern, it makes a wave. Then you have to do the same thing again in reverse for negatives, because remember, AC goes between positive and negative, it's not just positive, so you have to have 2 sets of transistors for positive and negative, and you've got 3 phases, meaning you need a total of 6 transistors. So you just follow this pattern, so you take your DC supply, pulse this pattern out, and you get a virtual AC wave. And that virtual wave is good enough for the AC motors, even though it's not actually a proper wave. So, if you've followed everything I've said so far, we can now get on to what it is that makes the 1996 train make its classic sound. But to explain this, you really need to understand everything. So you don't understand everything I've said so far, rewind the video and watch it again. If you do understand everything I've said so far, we can now talk about why it makes that and that sound is simply caused by a byproduct of how the artificial AC wave is created. Because remember, the result needed of the artificial AC wave is to make that wave at the frequency close to the motor's rotating frequency. That is the end result. How the wave is made doesn't actually matter, meaning a sound that's created in the creation of this wave is a byproduct. So when we're using a pattern-based method, like the pattern shown on this screen, you have a set pattern which is pulsed out, that makes your AC wave. Then to make the frequency get faster as the train speeds up, you simply do it faster. So as the train speeds up, same pattern, do it faster. Speeds up a bit more, you do the same pattern, but speed it up even quicker. But then we've got the limitation of transistors. So remember in the 80s with DC pulsing, transistors could only work at 200 times a second. Well, in the 90s with GTO transistors, it could only work at about 1,000 times a second. It's not until the 2000s, the late 90s, 2000s, you get transistors that can do more like 10,000 times a second pulsing. Because these transistors back in the 90s can only do about 1,000 times a second pulsing, as your wave speeds up, your pulsing also speeds up to create an AC wave. But the transistors are going to be overloaded because they're switching too fast. So you simply recreate your pattern but with less pulses, and that's what makes the sound. So you have one pattern, it speeds up, train speeds up, you need your output frequency to be sped up, so your pulsing speeds up to make an output frequency speeds up. Then as the pulses get quicker, it's pulsing too quick, so you remove some pulses, so the output frequency is unaffected. The output frequency is exactly the same, although slightly less accurate, because you've removed some pulses to stop the transistors being overloaded. And because the sound that's being made is due to the pulsing, every time you remove pulses, the sound goes back down, which is why you get sound to the train. So that is why the 1996 train makes its sound. So, why do modern trains not make that sound? Well, that is because of perfectionists who say at AC pulsing modulation, the pulsing should be completely unaffected by the output wave. And to do that, like with 80s DC PWM, it's always the set frequency, it doesn't change as the voltage changes. Where they do the same principle, but with AC PWM, they do it so as the frequency speeds up, it just pulses at the exact moment. So it's pulsing like, say like modern IGBT inverters are much quicker. So it's like about 4,000 times a second. It'll pulse exactly 4,000 times a second as the wave speeds up. So there'll be no relation between your pulsing frequency and your output frequency, which is like a perfectionist sort of ideal way of pulsing. So that means you don't get the sound on modern trains, and it's just the way it pulses. There's no difference in the way it works. There's no difference in the way that GTO inverters work to IGBT inverters work. All the only difference is IGBT inverters are faster without getting losses. That's the only difference. It's only because of the perfection in programming of the VF drives in modern day trains why they don't make that sound. But with the perfection way of pulsing, where it's always pulsing at a set frequency, for really fast waves, you have to pinpoint exactly where the pulses are, meaning on some trains, they switch back to old-fashioned pattern pulsing when it gets to 25 miles an hour. So it starts off with perfectionist pulsing, where pulsing's fixed. It makes that wave by changing how long it pulses for, between 0 and 100%, but your pulses themselves are completely fixed as the wave speeds up. Then when it gets to 25 miles an hour, switches back to pattern-based pulsing to get the exact pinpoints in where it pulses. And trains that do this are Electrostars and the 2009 train. Just take a listen to this. hopefully my video has been good enough to explain to you why trains make the sounds that they make. And one other thing, the Desiro. Desiros use perfectionist pulsing, where they continually change the frequency of the pulsing so there's no constant resonance at any particular frequency, which I personally think is a silly gimmick, but that's why I make that weird sound. So, if you have any questions about this, please leave me a comment in the comment section and I'll be happy to answer it.